Ever wonder how movies went from silent to talking? It wasn't just one moment, but a global evolution in having actors speak their lines aloud without having to rely on title cards and exaggerated acting to convey their emotions and tell the story. Join me as I explore the first technological advancements, their cultural impact, and the key players who revolutionized cinema forever. One of the first attempts at adding a soundtrack to a motion picture was when Thomas Edison and his employee William Dixon synchronized Edison's wax cylinder phonograph with his kinetoscope in the late 19th century. The kinetoscope was essentially a peep show machine, meant to be watched by one person at a time. Edison and Dixon's sound version, which they called a kinetophone, required the viewer to wear earphones. It was a novel invention for personal use, but projecting films with sync sound before a mass audience was still a dream. The first known coupling of recorded, synchronized sound with projected movies was in 1900 at the Paris Exposition or World's Fair. Many exciting wonders debuted there. From the top of the Eiffel Tower was demonstrated the auxeto-gramophone, stunning the crowds who could hear the music far below. The auxeto-gramophone was invented by an Englishman, Horace Short, with financial support from Thomas Edison. Auxeto meaning outer ear. With an auxeto-gramophone, the record needle controlled a valve which released compressed air so that Edison's phonograph recordings could be blasted over a large area. It was the world's first loudspeaker. Most importantly for us, not only were silent films being shown elsewhere at the exhibition, but the world's first talkie. Today when we say talkie, we mean the first motion pictures in which the soundtrack was embedded onto the film. That didn't come into widespread use until the 1920s. But here in 1900, we have a phonograph mechanically synchronized with a movie projector, dubbed the phono-cinema, to present movies with sync sound before a large audience. The phono-cinema theater, created by Clement-Maurice Gratiolet and Cléo Desmeraude, was set up in a pavilion at the fair. It combined moving images with manually synchronized sound, with a two-person crew using a wax cylinder phonograph to play recordings while projecting films of theatrical and musical performances. This innovative show featured famous actors, dancers, and musicians of the day. The films also featured hand-tinted colors, adding another layer of artistry and possibility to the films. And it's known as the first presentation of so-called talking pictures in the history of cinema. It made international headlines. Even the Indo-European Correspondence, a newspaper published in India by the Catholic Church, expressed wonderment at this technological marvel. 2 years later, Frenchman Léon Gaumont took the concept further, patenting the chronophone, the world's first sound-on-disc system. In other words, records instead of wax cylinders. The invention was still developmental and the apparatus was big and heavy. But it made headlines around the globe and even went on tour, not only in Europe and the US, but in cities throughout the French and British empires. In 1905, it was shown in the city of Calcutta, now Kolkata, India, at the Corinthian Theatre, a popular playhouse at the time by one of India's first Indian-owned film exhibitors, Elphinstone Bioscope. The Calcutta-based Statesman newspaper wrote in its review, "It was remarkable how perfectly the lips of the figure on the screen moved with the words from the talking machine." Elphinstone Bioscope was so ecstatic that they republished the entire review in their advertisements. In 1907, the chronophone was demonstrated in a royal command performance at Buckingham Palace. In 1911, Gaumont opened the Gaumont Palace in Paris, which billed itself as the greatest cinema theater in the world. In the United States, D.W. Griffith released his silent romance film Dream Street in 1921, some prints of which begin with a scene in which Griffith himself appeared on camera to speak to the audience. The film was distributed with a record containing his voice along with some sound effects for the movie. Griffith called this setup phono-cinema, which was invented by Orlando Kellum. Given the technology's experimental nature, only 2 theaters were equipped to use the phono-cinema setup. In other words, as you now know, Kellum had, perhaps unwittingly, reinvented the phono-cinema from over 20 years earlier, a sound-on-disc motion picture synchronization system. Nonetheless, in the US, we like to say, incorrectly, things like, D.W. Griffith pioneered the talking picture. Arguably true, but he was one of many, and he was 2 decades behind the curve. 5 years later, in 1926, Warner Brothers was still using this kind of technology when it debuted the Vitaphone system, which allowed a film's entire music score to be played on records synchronized with their films. Again, it's a description, in principle, of the 1900 phono-cinema and the 1902 chronophone. Innovation had flatlined and hadn't really evolved since 1900. That was finally about to change. In 1919, a U.S. inventor named Lee DeForest filed several patents for what would become the optical sound-on-film technology that we're most familiar with today, meaning the soundtrack didn't need to be played on a separate phonograph. It was embedded onto the film. DeForest and fellow inventor Theodore Case continued improving the system. At the same time in the US, Polish-born inventor Joseph Tykociński-Tykociner was separately building a similar technology. And, drumroll please, there it is. In 1922, he presented the first known US demonstration of a sound-on-film movie at the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. Sadly for him, his invention was never used commercially. But 1 year later, DeForest and Case's product would be. In 1923, at the Rivoli Theater in New York City, DeForest Phonofilms held the first public screening of movies with sync sound on film, and we were off and running. So, one could make the shaky case that the development of talkies started in the US and ended in the US, but there were a lot of other players in between. I've given you a lot of names, but even this isn't nearly an exhaustive list. I haven't given you the entire history of talkies, but now you know more about its origins and of its international impact on cinema. So the next time you see those beloved silent film stars like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, and then you imagine them speaking, remember the pioneers who made it happen.